morning. Let's get started. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day. I know Larry Balcom, when he started the Great Decisions during this time period, he did this because the weather's normally bad. So here we are with global warming. All right, so good morning. I'm Dr. Cindy Miller, President of the World Affairs Council, and Dr. Regina Karp is the Chair of Great Decisions. So on behalf of Dr. Karp and the Council, welcome to the 7th out of 8 Great Decisions series sessions. The Council would like to thank the Norfolk Commission on the Arts and Humanities for a generous grant to support Great Decisions, a Norfolk Academy, Dr. David Reselman and Headmaster Dennis Manning. Thank you so much for being here, for hosting this event. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors listed in your program, which includes Penrod, Bay Diesel, and SunTrust Bank. With their support, they've demonstrated a commitment to the community, education, and global standing of the Hampton Roads. And remember, after the session, you can always fill out the ballot that is in your program and let the forum council know about how you feel about these issues. Upcoming events, Thursday, March 8th is our program on Iran at the Slover Library with Dr. Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. Thursday, March 22nd at Old Dominion University, Ambassador Daniel Freed on where U.S. diplomacy has been, where it might be headed. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Karp to introduce our speakers.
Good morning again. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for coming out. And again, thank you for hosting us here at the Norfolk Academy. Today we're trying something new, but don't get used to it. Normally we have one speaker. Today we have 2. Special treat today. But it also is a very big and I think very important topic. We have 2 presentations this morning. One is on propaganda and news implications for the US and abroad, which will be delivered by Dr. Burton St. John III, who is a professor of communication and interim chair for communication and theatre arts department at Old Dominion University. He has published quite a number of books, journal articles, and he was also, one of his books was a finalist for the Association of Education in Journalism and Mass Communication Tankard Book Award. He has published numerous journals and edited volumes and has 15 years experience in professional public relations. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Mary Manjikian, who will speak on Russian cyber strategy as part of foreign policy. What you need to know. I really look forward to that. I've always wanted to find out what I needed to know about that. Dr. Manjikian is Associate Dean at the Robertson School of Government at Regent University in Virginia Beach. She received a BA from Wellesley College, an MPhil from Oxford University, and an MA and PhD from the University of Michigan. She also is the author of a number of books, and most recently, she authored a textbook entitled Cybersecurity Ethics and Introduction. That was just published in 2017. Her work has also appeared in many different journals, and in 2013 she was a Fulbright Scholar at the Institute of Advanced Study at Durham University in the UK. But she also had a previous career. She's a former US Foreign Service officer with service in the Netherlands, Russia and Bulgaria. And at Regent, she teaches courses on intelligence and terrorism. Welcome to our speakers. I have asked Dr. St. John to start us off with his presentation on propaganda and news, and that will then be followed by Dr. Manjikian, and then a break, our usual break, and then we come back for an exchange with our 2 presenters. Thank you very much.
Well, these are definitely interesting times for dealing with the constant flow of information that we see from what are apparently not only internal domestic news sources, but external sources. And probably most of you are well aware in the continuing discussion about how there are possibilities and signs that Russian or Russian-paid operators have been doing many things, or did many things, with the 2016 election, and will likely continue to do so coming up in the midterm elections Of course, this is a lot of the subtext for in connections with the Robert Mueller investigation of just, which we heard indictments some more that were given yesterday. But what may that all have to do with the idea of propaganda and the news? Well, there are some connections that you will see, and by the time that I get to the end of this in about 25 minutes or so, I'll swing back to saying a few things about how there are some larger trend lines we might want to be looking for, including the news that we kind of just heard yesterday about how this is a continuing area of investigation. Back during the 2016 election time period, social media, all those arenas of media where information is put up, not vetted, not going through any traditional news sources. They can be on these interactive sites. The social media sites have true interactivity where people can post things and respond. Sites like Facebook, Instagram. Facebook, though, in particular, gets a lot of attention. And then there are just plain old websites, that are still around, putting up information posted to see, not as interactive, but they're there. This is the kind of information. This is actually an example of one that was on Twitter on the left, another interactive social media site. Justin Trudeau is Fidel Castro's son. Rumors floating about they sure look alike. Okay. No substance to any of that. But there's certain kind of trolling. This idea of trolling being to try to disturb the news ecosphere and get people kind of confused or wondering. I'll relate to the very end about, by the way, why there is a certain motivation for that we want to watch for. Over here on the right, Perez Hilton, not a journalist. He's a celebrity infotainment provider, kind of a rumor monger. He's kind of popular. On his particular Facebook feed, Hillary Clinton gets more votes than any candidate ever. That's not even remotely true. Not remotely true. She's not even in the top 5. All right, so these are the kind of things that are out there. And by the way, credit to, I didn't want to forget, at the beginning, Sarah Fite and Kate Newton from Episcopal High School in Alexandria, Virginia. They're a couple of really good information literacy people. They provided some of the information, a lot of it here, but I've added into some of this, so I wanted to give them due credit. Some of the things in vocabulary, these are some categories that they've provided, and they seem to be mostly accurate. The idea of misinformation, all right, as composed to, like, look at misinformation on the left, and the idea of disinformation down here on the bottom right, all right. Misinformation is just incorrect information, they say, but it's not intentional. Down over here is disinformation, which a lot of people, including the president, like to throw around the term fake news, which is problematic to use the term fake news, but still it's being used a lot to talk about intentionally false information, like the stuff we saw on the slide a moment ago. And then we have another form of fake news, which is the news satire, which would have been the evening programs that are kind of popular, say, for example, The Daily Show that Jon Stewart used to do, now Trevor Noah does. Then we have your traditional hoax. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on hoax. The one I'm more interested in, bottom left, is propaganda. Their definition is a little limited. It's often called biased or misleading, used to promote a political cause or point of view. But people, for a long time, I think this is one of the problems we have with propaganda, it seems to be what is in the eye of the beholder, how people want to actually define what they think is the intent is. But for well over 20 years now, I've been studying propaganda, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of it is not only what's in the eye of the beholder, but it's kind of figuring out what it is not. Lots of times it helps you define what it is. This is my definition about what propaganda is, based on particularly looking at a lot of domestic propaganda. I'm not particularly extensively versed in looking at international, but I do think understanding how propaganda operates in the U.S. tells us a lot about how international players may see how we're particularly weak in being able to address propaganda. And you can see that this definition would work for what individuals thought propaganda was doing or what it attempted to do during the 2016 election cycle. Now, some experts maintain that, say for example, the trolls that were putting out false information during the 2016 election were trying to do things like accentuate voter turnout or, excuse me, depress voter turnout in other arenas. But there are other experts that say it may not necessarily be so. Once again, I'll hold that thought to the very end about implications, and we'll come back to that. This is some of the reasons why propaganda gets a little more complicated to go through and go, oh, that's just propaganda, that's just lies, that's just mistruths, that's the Justin Trudeau, Fidel Castro son thing. Now, my definition of what we saw on the first two slides, those really weren't propaganda. You know, they were straight out misinformation, made up stuff to confuse people, where really, if you look down here to what's going on with propaganda, you can see that it really kind of looks at where people are vulnerable, how you can get people to move. Look in the upper right. There's actually been, and I researched quite a bit in this, the area of propaganda that is used in different ways to move masses of people, to appeal to common values, to appeal to ways to get people to think, yes, that new idea, that way of going in a particular direction is, to my mind, a propaganda that's not necessarily about lying. It may be about stretching the truth. It may be about exaggerating some truths or exaggerating commonalities. But in my mind, that is some of the more pernicious and potentially dangerous aspects of what really propaganda is like. This is called integration propaganda. It's a term that was used by Jacques Ellul, who a scholar dating back some 50 years ago. He was observing it in a book called Propaganda. He devoted only a really small part of the book, surprisingly, to talking about it. And if he was alive today, seeing what's going on with social media and how people feel like a personal appeal or a one-to-one kind of touch through social media, and how that can be used by purveyors of propaganda, he may be, if he was here, more intrigued to look at how these new technologies may allow for this kind of sense of integration propaganda. In general, the whole idea of propaganda from the pre-modern age has a lot to do with the word going with propagation of faith, once again, so there was kind of like a personal kind of appeal, but related to an institution, which was the Catholic Church. But the modern era of what we understand propaganda and the idea of weaponizing it, or the way of trying to appeal to a broad mass, really comes out of World War I. Right? So before the U.S. even got involved in World War I, for several years there was international propaganda from both the Axis side and from the Ally side to try to get the U.S. to pay attention to what was going on in Europe. But we really didn't start doing a lot of our own thinking about propaganda until Woodrow Wilson said, we're going to form our own propaganda bureau called the Committee on Public Information. And that really got people into the camp of, once again, moving masses, telling people it's important value to do this, let's support this war, let's do what we need to do. So that's how some contemporary understandings that I see of what really is propaganda is interesting. Not necessarily what we see when people talk about propaganda being like in international or domestic politics and war. Because we still see a lot of propaganda that has nothing to do with either one of those. We just need to be more aware of it. This relates to a lot of things that are susceptible for journalism. We have journalism having these kind of practices, which are based on the idea of we need to be objective. By the way, the idea of objective journalism really comes from journalism going, we really kind of got messed around with that propaganda that Woodrow Wilson did and got us into this war. So by the 1920s, you started seeing a lot of these hallmarks of journalism start to arise. Now this is traditional journalism, right? And so we have a lot of it translated into what we see in these areas here about drama, conflict, and novelty. But usually it has to be supported by, do we get these kind of things here? Do we get some way of trying to approximate the truth better? But no matter what they're doing, propagandists still find ways, especially through these areas here, to get their stories in traditional news media. This is Stephen Reiner's discussion about how we see journalism work traditionally, what we understand, verification, looking at who are independent individuals or organizations that are directly accountable. Notice that when you put a lot of things up in social media and you're looking at disinformation or outright attempts to move people with propaganda, you don't have these things going on. You don't have verification, you don't have credible sources, what have you. This is what's interesting about where people say they get information, what is their trust level. The local news, in this source here, they looked at 82% said they find it trustworthy. Probably has a lot to do with those practices I showed you before, what people think are credible, believable practices. You go down to friends and family, the national news here, and then you can see how social media drops way off. Okay? But even though the credibility factor is much lower, we should not feel comforted by that. There are some reasons. We have a whole bunch of drop-off on what's going on with declining print media. These are revenue trends, all right? Up here is the advertising trends, dropping down back to where they were. That's the amount of money they're getting from advertising, dropping back down to over 40 years ago rates of revenue, all right? And at the same time, we see circulation flat. So the big question on this is, if we have a traditional news media that can still be reliable to us in the face of propaganda, where's it going to be? Because there's no monetary support. This is continuing to be a problem. Notice at the same time, I know it's a little fuzzy, but it's the best image I could get off it from the Pew Research Center. Newspaper circulation dropped in 1 year by 7%. That's just 1 year. We have local TV, even though it has seemed more credible. Late night drops 5%. Local morning drops 2%. These are viewership numbers. Readership numbers drop 7% for newspapers. Cable TV up by 8% in 1 year. What's a problem with that is cable TV does very little original news reporting. They are on 24 hours a day. They can't come up and they won't devote the amount of resources they need to put in new substantive news hour after hour. This is why we have talking heads over and over, because they are cheaper. It does not necessarily mean you are getting any verifiable, accountable, data-sourced news, right? So we have concerns here about how does that help us in dealing with propaganda that may be in society. Look at the same time what's happening with Facebook engagement on election stories. Mainstream news stories, which can be fed into Facebook, and often are, show that they were dropping from February to August, election day, down to 7.3 million. What was been classified as fake news or bogus information, the engagement with that actually surpassed mainstream news stories on Facebook. There's ways to track this. You see people putting like buttons on, resharing it, retweeting. Those are all engagement factors. It dropped. So we had the top performing fake election news stories on Facebook had more engagement than the top stories from major news sources. That's what BuzzFeed traced. Once again, disconcerting. This number is the total number of engagement stories that they track, or engagement levels rather, that they track among some top fake news stories. I don't remember exactly how many they were tracking. But they tracked at least 8.7 million engagement nodes, or people were, that many eyeballs were seeing this, versus the same stories that were in traditional news outlets that were on Facebook. So there's a difference right there, substantive difference, over a million, almost 1.5 million. A snapshot of who are the kind of people creating some of this fake information. Well, there's a fellow named Boris out in Macedonia who was cracking out a whole bunch of these stories as a way of making some of his living in a way. He would make 4 or 5 posts and put them up the next day. Then he'd come back, he'd go do some things, take a break, and then go out, come back. He would find more articles and share them on Facebook. So he had an agenda, and in many ways I think he was putting up a lot of fake posts that were pro-Trump to have them go out and around. And he was making $16,000 a month. There were ways that he was monetizing this, and I don't know when they said this, I don't have enough background to say if this were some tracking analytics that he was getting paid for, like on Google, say for example, you can get paid versus by how many views you're getting. But we also have information which is becoming more clear since Mueller's indictments, that there's a hub of activity of very well-financed Russian oligarchs who were paying what was called like an internet research company that was doling out money, to a lot of people like Boris. Right? So who knows exactly where all the different funding was, but that's what he's reporting that he was making. What's going on with the audiences? Why are we even receptive to some of this stuff? Well, there's this thing called confirmation bias. And so we're going to accept things that kind of already go with our point of view. A couple of the things that work also is selective reception and selective retention. So selective reception is really easy to do. It basically says I only want to pay attention to certain things that I find interesting. That is really easy to do in the social media age because you just choose to unfollow all the things that you don't care about. And then selective retention is you just kind of remember only those things that go with your point of view. Some quick numbers about why this is all potentially dangerous. What's going on with kids in middle school and high school? So our next age of media consumers that may be subject to propaganda, whether they're domestic or international sources. If you are under the age of 18, you are likely to say Facebook is your primary news source. Very scary. Very scary. Right? At the same time, this is no surprise because national data trends say that when it comes to reading print of any kind, magazines or newspapers, across all Americans, only 2 in 10 say they consult a weekly magazine, printed magazine or printed newspaper, 2 in 10, right? That's important because to try to read things online is a very skimming experience. You don't get immersive reading. Most people don't. With reading any kind of news articles that are from an online newspaper or online magazine rather. 82% of middle schoolers says they can't distinguish between something that says it's sponsored content and a real story. All right? They can't figure that out on a website, even when it's labeled. All right? 3 out of 4 middle schoolers say they don't really have any reason to distrust articles even if they look at it and see that it comes from Boris in Macedonia. They just will go, well, okay. They're not really sit there carefully analyzing what's going on. And also another 3 out of 4 high schoolers say they can't tell the difference between a Facebook verified account and something that could have been, somebody stole the identity of somebody and put it up. They won't be able to go through and tell and have mechanisms to try to figure out who they are. If it has graphics on a website, 30% of high schoolers say they think it's more trustworthy. This actually replicates, I've worked with another researcher who says the same thing happens with print media, so not surprising that this had happened with online. So what are some things to talk about think about in the last 5 minutes or so here? We have particular trend lines going on in our country that really make us vulnerable to weaponized propaganda. Okay, weaponized propaganda, as I stated earlier, has been around now for easily 100 years. Well, Woodrow Wilson was really one of the first ones to do this. He started the Committee on Public Information, hired all sorts of excellent writers and artists. People that were in journalism were actually beholden to supporting a lot of the CPI. The Pulitzer Prize in 1918 was given to a writer who wrote an editorial that basically replicated all the pro-war messages that the CPI was putting out. All right? So we definitely have a long history of being subject to this. What will make it particularly dangerous for us is what's going on with our audiences. Our millennials and our Gen Xers are not necessarily very steeped in going, well, I really want to read longer form news accounts and really look carefully at the sources and get an idea of what's going on. And therefore, we will have more actors, domestically and internationally, that will try to get what looks like news out to us. There will be increasing pressure for different players to try to turn Google and Facebook into news sources to be regulated by the FCC or the FTC. We're seeing that now. I don't know if that will happen anytime soon. We will have to wonder if we will look at new models for U.S. journalism. There are countries in Europe that have a tax or a subsidy for nonprofit press. The BBC in England has long assessed a tax for people that have television sets so that the BBC is subsidized. These are not unthinkable models. They are, at this time in the U.S., unthinkable because we don't like the idea of any kind of government subsidy, even indirect if it's a pass-through to journalism. But I think at some stage we'll have to be thinking about this. The last 2 things to finish. We do run the real risk of, if there's a critical mass of disinformation and we can't verify it fast enough, triggering somebody in a position of power to overreact. We do have that genuine risk because the American public is not becoming well steeped to look critically at what's going on with a triggering event. And somebody in a position of power could use it as an opportunity to say, well, here's a modern Gulf of Tonkin War, kind of incident I could use. And if you don't remember the Gulf of Tonkin, that whole thing was fabricated to set up our intervention into Vietnam. And that could happen much quicker and faster now in this environment because people are not with the skill sets to be able to critically look at this. Last thing is, probably a much more real danger is some experts have said that a lot of the trolling that we see from the Russians that had happened and will continue to happen was not necessarily designed to either try to help Trump win or Clinton lose. not necessarily designed to affect directly voting or voting turnout, but it was designed to sow confusion. That the idea was to go, the more weird information you get that contradictory, that goes all around, the less you will want to exert your own critical faculties and instead defer to somebody or some institutions that are authoritarian. So this is something I think we also have to watch out to as a genuine risk. And the best thing to do is probably to fall back in the last minute to possibly a simple bromide, but maybe a good one, is when it comes to news and news consumption, it's best to have a buyer beware approach. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all this morning. I think Burton's presentation and mine go together very well. He's kind of given us kind of a general introduction for how to think about news, how to think about themes like propaganda. And now I'm going to give you some ideas about how to think about how Russia in particular is using some of these tools that he has described. I have 4 main points I want to make this morning. We have a tendency when we talk about Russia to think about it is so unique that we can't kind of use our usual ways of thinking about international relations to think about Russia. Remember, Churchill once said that Russia was a riddle wrapped inside an enigma. And I guess wrapped inside a mystery beyond that. And we also have this tendency, I think particularly those of us who are probably of a more advanced age, to think of cyber as something fundamentally new and different from anything we've ever encountered before. And so I want to leave you with a couple things today. First, Russian cyber warfare policy is not entirely new. It is rather a continuation, as Burton suggested, of existing strategies and tactics. It's something the Russians have always done very well. Even when they were the Soviet Union, they've often been very, very good at propaganda. They've often been very good at psychological operations, information warfare. Why would anybody decide to hire an army of Russian trolls when they have all those military weapons? Well, this new domain, we sometimes call it the fifth domain. So we have land, air, sea, space, and then we have cyber. Its main advantage is kind of that it's cheap, right? An army of Russian trolls that you pay $5 an hour is definitely cheaper than making another, carrier or something like that. I'm sure a lot of y'all are military people here, and you know how much those military budgets can be. And it's also very flexible, right? You don't have to plan for it several years in advance the way you do for any other type of big military weapon you want to create. So as I've said, it's not useful to think of Russian cyber measures as separate from traditional warfare capabilities. Rather, they're very much integrated into Russia's overall foreign policy strategy. And I suggest that you think of cyber warfare, you think of information warfare as a force multiplier, right? It helps you if you can basically get your enemy, you can get them so they don't have the situational awareness they should have, you can confuse them, and then you can do other things faster because you've taken them off guard, right? Sun Tzu's talked about the importance of surprise. So you can go all the way back to 5,000 years BC. So as we said, new forms of warfare, they're cheaper, they're faster, and conflicts themselves are sped up. So what I pulled here is, this is a poster from World War II. It says, defend the homeland, Moscow. So what we see is kind of the Russians have been making propaganda posters, for over 100 years. This notion of controlling the narrative, right? And that's basically kind of what the communists wanted us to do, right? They wanted us to think about the bourgeoisie, and they wanted us to think about the rise of the proletariat. They wanted to tell us a particular story and get the rest of the world to kind of buy their story, right? They exported that story to Africa. They exported that story to Latin America. And that's what they were trying to do, is they were trying to get people to sort of see things through their lens. And that's what they're still doing now. And they're using these methods we've heard about, disinformation, propaganda, and psychological operations. I had a slide, but I took it out because we ran out of time. It was a McCassell, and it talked about how those of us who are old enough to remember the first time someone introduced us to the internet, it seemed kind of magical, didn't it? It just seemed incredible. And we were all so optimistic. Remember we talked about the global village, and we were all going to hold hands, and we were going to sing Kumbaya. You know, and then somehow or other we went from talking about the global village to talking about American cyberspace and Russian cyberspace. And I think what's really going on now is you can think of cyberspace as a global commons, and what we're really doing is we're fighting a new Cold War, right? We're trying to block out our own spheres of influence in that commons called cyberspace. And so just like the Russians were trying to establish a foothold in Angola and, you know, the Congo and all those places back in the 1500s, or in the 1950s, now what they're really trying to do is they're trying to sort of establish footholds throughout the world in cyberspace. They're not the only ones doing it. Just briefly, they don't even have the biggest budget in terms of cyberspace troops, if you will. But all countries now are spending billions of dollars, really, to have a cyber army to augment our traditional armies. The Russian security organization, Medusa, explained sort of how they created this internet research agency, which created all those trolls around the time of the American elections. They recruited academics and they recruited hackers, and they've been doing this since 2007. The Russian cyber war with Estonia was 2007. The Russian cyber war with Georgia was 2008. So they already have 10 years of experience doing this. So I think we're kind of playing catch up in a lot of ways. So they've basically been developing what we're calling offensive cyber weapons. And so this is, you know, stuff like hacking into, you know, DoD assets, but also these psychological operations as well. So why is Russia spending so much money and so much time establishing this foothold in cyberspace? Well, they don't see it as separate from real space. They see it as a way of kind of capturing territory and kind of winning wars. And I think we see this very much with the Russian election hacking, right? Even though it all occurred in cyberspace, it's having real-world effects. And that's what they're hoping. Russia's foreign minister talked about how Russia sees Moscow as locked in an ongoing existential struggle to challenge its security in the information realm. We talked about this briefly. Why do people want to use cyber warfare? As we said, it makes geography irrelevant, right? You can kind of invade our cyberspace even if you're sitting, you know, what is it, you're a fat guy sitting on a bed in your mother's basement, wherever you are, you don't actually need to go to the United States to attack the United States, right? So there's this irrelevance of geography, the speed at which you can operate, and this thing called the attribution problem. It's often very difficult to figure out where a tweet came from or where it was registered or even where a cyber attack came from. You can ping it around the world. You can use things like Tor, anonymizing software. You can make it so that it's very difficult to actually talk about who sent that tweet. And I find that particularly interesting now because we're sort of dancing around this subject of whether or not what happened with Russia was kind of official or unofficial, right? I thought it was very interesting that those indictments listed people as being private citizens. It didn't call them members of the security service. It didn't call them military actors or something like that. And that's the whole problem with this attribution problem, is it's very difficult to draw that straight line between an individual and an institution and an action. As we said, the whole thing about information operations is they're asymmetric, right? A very small party can go up against a very large party. We use that term asymmetric when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about guerrilla warfare. The two sides don't need to be evenly matched. So things like information warfare, particularly in the realm of information operations, psychological operations, they can be performed by non-state actors. And basically, the person who's doing the attacking has the advantage. It's much cheaper to attack than it is to defend. But when we really want to understand what it is that Russia's doing, I always like to go back to this 2013 article which appeared in the Russian journal by name Little Military Thought by a fellow named General Gerasimov. And he said in the future, wars are going to be fought with a 4-to-1 ratio of non-military to military measures. And among these non-military measures, we have subversion, espionage, propaganda, and cyber attacks. And the thing about these non-military measures is we can destabilize an enemy at minimal cost. And so we saw this Gerasimov doctrine playing out in Syria. We're told when faced with a combination of pressure and interference, a perfectly thriving state can be transformed into an arena of fierce armed conflict, become a victim of foreign intervention, and sink into a web of chaos, humanitarian catastrophe, and civil war. So what they're saying is that it's possible to destabilize a regime very quickly using some of these cyber tools and using some of these information tools. And so this is what's interesting in that article. Gerasimov says, victory is assured if an opponent's political and economic system is made ungovernable, its population demoralized, and its key military-industrial complex is destroyed or damaged beyond repair. What Russia wants is information superiority on the military side, and they want to do things like fight in an anticipatory sense. Rather than waiting until they're attacked, they want to sort of be the attacker. So when we think about their actions in cyberspace, we often talk about offensive cyber activity, and they often don't distinguish, as we've seen, between military and civilian targets. When they're thinking about taking down something, they might take down the records of, a hospital or something like that. And these types of activities are not governed by things like the laws of armed conflict. At least they do not feel that they are. So we see that a lot of what they're doing is violating the sovereignty of other nations, interfering in elections, targeting civilian political officials, releasing private information, what we call doxing. And what they're really trying to do, as Burton mentioned, is to, in a sense, kind of destabilize the U.S., further the polarization among our citizens, and cause citizens really to begin doubting the legitimacy of their regimes, the legitimacy of their elected officials, and the legitimacy of the elections themselves. So what specifically are they doing? A fellow named Brandon Valeriano says, in a sense, they're fighting against us, but it's really a lot more like covert activity than it is like a declared war. When you talk about something like hiring an army of trolls to kind of sow seeds of discord on Twitter, what you're really talking about is covert activity. So some of these military methods are things like helping to organize mass demonstrations, right? All of those agents who were somehow or other involved in setting up those pro-Trump and those pro-Hillary rallies, right? The people who dressed up in costumes and so on and so forth. The outsourcing of operations to contractors, the use of information management. So one of the things we talk about is this idea of provocation. Take control of your enemies in secret and encourage them to do things that discredit them and help you. And I would argue that by reaching out to political operatives, as they did in Florida, that follows sort of the traditional Russian idea of provokatsia, right? You plant your own agent provocateurs and you flip legitimate activists, turning them to your side, right? This use of something called active measures, sowing conspiracy theories, planting false information in foreign newspapers, getting audiences to believe that their government is lying to them in not sharing information. And Michael Weiss, an analyst, refers to the weaponization of money, culture, and information. Again, this idea of disinformation, something the Russians have always been very, very good at. And the thing to realize about disinformation is that it's really insidious, because they'll take something that people are kind of willing to believe because it sort of fits in with their own biases, and something that often has an element of truth to it. And so I'm just going to give you one quick anecdote. When I worked in Russia in the 1990s, I was in charge of a program that brought something like 10,000 Russian students who were high school students to the United States every year to study. And we ran the program through subcontractors, and I would meet with the subcontractors, people like Youth for Understanding, and I'd ask them, I'd say, how's the program going? Are you encountering any problems? And I sat with these contractors, and they said, we keep encountering parents who seem to have heard two rumors about our program. One is that the only reason the United States is running this program is they want to take kids from Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, and they want to put them in with families that are Christian, and they want to convert them to Christianity. The second rumor is that this is some kind of work program. They're going to take you to a farm in Kansas, and they're going to make you go and milk a cow. And they said, we have no idea where these stories are coming from. So I called kind of their bosses' bosses. I called the people who owned these contracting agencies in the United States, and I said, we're hearing these rumors. Can you tell us anything? And regarding the first one, this idea that you're going to be forcibly converted to Christianity, I talked to a fellow, and he said to me, have you ever been to a small town in Texas, a rural area? And I said, well, my sister's roommate at college was in a small town in Texas. And he said, I'm talking about the kind of place where on Friday nights you drive up and down Main Street and you wave to each other because there's nothing else to do, right? He said, so there's a youth group in town and they're going bowling on Wednesday night. And it's the only activity in town. And he says, so of course they invite the foreign kid because it would be rude not to. Right? So there's an element of truth to that story. If I'm a Muslim kid from Kazakhstan and I go and live in Texas, somebody's going to invite me to church, right? But it's not because they want to forcibly convert you to Christianity. It's because they're being friendly, right? And that's what disinformation is. So I said, well, what about, the milk and the cow story in Kansas? And he said, well, we tell families that adopt a kid into their home for a year from abroad, treat them like a family member. He says, so if all the other kids in the family have chores, then Ivan's going to get chores too, right? And if he's from a wealthy family in Moscow where nobody's ever asked him to make his bed before, he might very well tell his parents that he's been, conscripted into some form of forced labor camp or something. But it wouldn't actually be accurate, right? But there's an element of truth to it. And that's the thing about disinformation, is it's not completely wrong, it's just sort of wrong, right? So I think that's a useful distinction. Feverish, if believable lies cooked up by Moscow Center and planted in friendly media outlets to make the nation look sinister, right? So this is what this looks like now in the U.S. Great, 10 minutes. These are some of the things you might have encountered this year if you're on Twitter, right? Sort of allegations that the U.S. elections were rigged. Hashtag not my president. Allegations that the leader is illegitimate. Hashtag resist. Allegations that the police cannot be trusted. Hashtag Charlottesville. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Hashtag Ferguson. Television lies. Hashtag fake news. Conspiracy theories. The government planned the Parkland massacre in order to implement gun control. The students aren't really students. They're plants paid by some sinister foreign force, right? So these are the kinds of stories then that Russian agents are going to pick up on, and these trolls who are being paid, they're going to sort of continue to retweet these stories. They're going to create new stories. And the goal is not, as Burton pointed out, to necessarily kind of win or lose a particular election. It's something much bigger. The way I like to think of it in my own mind is I think about centripetal and centrifugal forces. If you think about Weimar Germany back in 1917, what happened was this really obscure, little teeny-weeny, wacko political party somehow or other got its ideas into the mainstream, right? Those wacko ideas went from being all the way out there in the fringes to somehow or other getting sucked into the main part of the political discussion. And I would argue that's kind of what the Russians are trying to do, is they're trying to take these wacko fringe extremist ideas, racism, anti-Semitism, right? Anti-immigration, and they're trying to kind of take these out of sort of that wacko fringe and kind of move them more towards the center. That's what's going on here. And as a result, that's kind of centrifugal force. I always get them confused. Centripetal is inward, right? Okay, so that's the centrifugal force. And then the centrifugal force is if you have a politician who finds himself moving farther to the left or farther to the right in order to capture more and more of these wacko fringe ideas, right? And so I think that's their playbook. I think their playbook is Weimar Germany, and that's what really kind of scares me. That's what they're trying to do, is they're trying to turn us into extremists. And they do that by trolling, sowing discord on social media, starting quarrels, turning every conversation into a fight, right? Turning us against one another. Again, the Internet Research Agency, annual budget of $10 million. These employees are expected to post on news articles 50 times a day. They have to have fake Facebook accounts. They have to publish a certain number of posts daily. And so the other point I want to make is they're not the only ones who do this. The United States has also kind of had information warriors who've been sort of tasked with going onto jihadist websites, right? And posing as moderate Islamic folks. That's why they're hiring all those people who speak Arabic and so on and so forth. So countries have always done this, right? But what's interesting is sort of, if the United States is doing this, it's doing it against jihadists, whereas Russia's doing this against civilians, right? Russia's kind of doing this to manipulate people like you and me. And as we pointed out, if you do this correctly, it's difficult to distinguish real from fake news. It makes all news suspect, and people may decide that they don't trust any kind of news. And this could certainly be difficult. If you think about where we live, you know how like when it's hurricane season, they tell you to know what zone it is, so you know when it is, you're supposed to get on the road and go. If you were getting updates or something on your phone about that evacuation pattern in a hurricane, and you didn't know whether or not they were real, right? It would certainly complicate that situation. Are we able to actually make this link work? Sean?
Yep.
Okay.
It got me thinking about my full-time employees and their ability to survive on $8 an hour in New York City. And foremost in all of our minds has been the loss and the grief felt by the people of Orlando. Most of us don't get our health care through the marketplace. We get it through our job or through Medicare or Medicaid. And what you should know is that, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, your coverage is better today than it was before. Women can get free checkups, and you can't get charged more just for being a woman. To give his employees come together to pass a common bill that would boost America's very, very hard times. Some progress, at least within the small confines of the legal community. I think it's real important.
Here we go. President Barack Obama, when you're giving a speech, make sure you use a lot of pauses.
America's businesses have created 14.5 million new jobs over 75 straight months.
We're developing technology. Every technology can be used in some negative way, and so we all should work towards making sure that it's not going to happen. And even one of the interesting directions is that once you know how to create something, you know how to reverse engineer it. And so you can, and so one could create methods for identifying edited videos versus real videos.
Okay, so the reason I showed you that is, imagine with that situation in Hawaii where they were told that a nuclear strike was imminent. Imagine if instead of just getting a little text message on your phone, hackers were actually able to get in to, say, CNN, and they were able to put up a faked video of Trump telling us that the bombing starts in 5 minutes. Imagine the chaos that would ensue. And that's not really enough time to go back and reverse engineer the video and figure out where it came from, is it? And so I really think that's something we need to bear in mind, that I think this is really kind of the future of some of this cyber warfare, and it's terrifying. Just briefly, the RAND Corporation says we're in a period of something which they call truth decay. They say there's increasing disagreement about facts and analytical interpretations of facts and data, right? We don't agree whether or not climate change is real, whether or not, vaccines cause autism, all that kind of stuff. The blurring of lines between opinion and fact, the increasing volume and importance of opinion and personal experience over fact. and declining trust in formerly respected sources of factual information. So in the future, it's not going to get any better. People will begin to use artificial intelligence to more carefully target the attacks, to more carefully target the types of fake news that you might see on your page. They will use big data that will figure out what demographic groups you fit into, and this stuff will be more and more targeted. As I said, the idea of these kind of fake videos, I think they're going to be very compelling, and it's going to make it very, very hard to sort out kind of fact from reality. So I wish I had better news to leave you with, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And certainly you're welcome to buy my book on Amazon. Thank you.